The ships were promised. We were told their engines would burn like torches in the void, proof that the Imperium never forgets its children. But the ships never came. Days stretched into months, prayers turned to whispers, and whispers to fear. What happens to faith when hope rots into silence? When every night sky is a question with no answer? This is not just a story of waiting. It is a story of betrayal carved into the bones of a world. Stay until the end, because the final cost was worse than death, a waiting world. Its skies starless, swollen with clouds that never break. The horizon does not change, and yet every set of eyes turns upward, searching for the faint burn of thrusters that should already be here. The people whisper their prayers to steel gods, words offered like sparks into a void that swallows all sound. I was there. I remember the air, heavy with the taste of rust, as though even the wind had grown old from waiting. Days were measured not by the passage of suns, but by the tremor in my own chest, hours counted by the rhythm of my heart. And with each beat, the silence grew louder. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Governors made promises they no longer believed. Priests raised their voices, louder each night, but their hymns trembled at the edges. What was once hope hardened into ritual, then rotted into habit. Every heartbeat stretched into an eternity of doubt. And in that stretched-out eternity, something dark began to move unseen, but felt, in the marrow of everyone who still believed the black ships would come. This is the story of waiting in Warhammer 40K. Not the waiting of patience, not the waiting of faith, but the waiting that hollows out a soul. The Imperium promised deliverance, and the people obeyed. They gathered their children, they whispered their prayers, and they surrendered to the silence, trusting that salvation would arrive. But what happens when it does not? What happens when the black ships fail to return? The truth is not just absence. It is corruption. Without the vessels to collect the psykers, the warp does not remain still. It presses inward, it bleeds through the cracks, and the very air becomes a conduit for terror. The waiting world is no longer a world of faith. It becomes a breeding ground for heresy, madness, and despair. By the end of this story, you will see how silence itself becomes the deadliest weapon of all. Not fire, not steel, not even the warp's raw violence, but silence unanswered, unbroken, endless silence that eats through hope until nothing remains but the terrible cost of having believed in the first place. The summons did not arrive as thunder, but as paper. Thin, gray, official, the kind of parchment that smells like dust and command. A sigil pressed in black wax, an eagle with a blindfold of ink, the letters edged so hard they seemed to cut light. Couriers moved through the habs at dawn, knocking once, twice, never a third time. Doors opened to faces that had not yet learned how to fear the word psyker, though they knew how to fear everything else. Taxes, quotas, curfews, the steady gnaw of scarcity. The summons named names. It placed a line between before and after. They called it a census, then a blessing. Then, when the priests took the same wording and sang it with rhythm, a deliverance. Gather the gifted, the placards read. Sanction is coming. The administratum clerk who read the announcement from the cathedral steps spoke in a voice that had been weighed and measured by 10,000 previous announcements. There was no tremor, no poetry. All minors exhibiting dream tremors, involuntary speech during sleep, sensitivity to light, or anomalous perception. were present at the muster field within 48 standard. He did not look up from the slate once. He did not need to. The city was already looking at itself. Rumor did the rest. The kind that slips through markets like a draft, making the hair on your arms rise without knowing why. Mothers told mothers. Foremen told their crews, and then told them to keep working. Children, hearing the word gifted, stood taller, while their parents' shoulders sank. And behind every street corner whisper, there was the same certainty pressed into the wax of the summons. The black ships are en route. Engines like black suns. Holds like cathedrals. Scrutiny like absolution. They will make it safe, said the priest to the old woman in the second row who lit 2 candles every morning, one for the living and one for the dead. They will make him useful, said the scribe to the father who could not stop looking at his daughter's hands, as if her fingers might confess for her. We counted the days by the way the announcements changed. First, a census. Second, a muster. Third, an oath. Parents were told to bring the children by first light, clothed plainly, carrying nothing other than identification and any medicines. There was an efficiency to the language that made everything seem routine. Routine calms people. Routine makes room for dread to sit down quietly next to you and fold its hands. I remember the night before the first muster. The city did not sleep. It pretended to sleep, which is a different thing. Windows were dark, but ears were open. We listened for engines and heard our own breath dot at dawn. The line formed, not a line, a procession. There is a difference. A line is impatient. A procession is resigned. Families walked the long road to the field beyond the manufactoria, where the ground was already scarred by decades of parades that celebrated victories nobody saw. The mustering officers erected arches of wire and canvas, long tables, chronometers ticking in glass domes, ink pads, sensors. A banner flapped with a double-headed eagle stitched in thread that had faded from gold to something like old straw. Children stood with their names pinned to their collars. The pins looked too heavy for the cloth. The tests were small humiliations dressed as kindnesses. Hold out your hands. Describe this picture without looking at it. Tell me the number I am. Thinking. The number was always the same, the next number in the ledger. Some children wept and were comforted. Some laughed and were not. One boy put his palm on the table and burned a perfect circle into the varnish without meaning to. His mother clapped her own hand over his, as if she could stop 2 kinds of fire with one gesture, and the officer nodded to a scribe, who nodded to another officer, who made a mark on a different slate. This is what escalation looks like in the Imperium. It looks like marks multiplying on slates. You could feel the warp near the end of the first hour, though nobody would dare say it. It was in the way sounds stacked and then unstacked. It was in the way the shadow of the chronometer hands seemed to lag. It was in the way a girl with milk-white eyes smiled at nothing and everything, while the priest dabbed oil on her brow and said words that tasted like metal. A rumor took shape inside the rumor. The black ships were very close. They wait for a proper tally, someone said. They won't waste fuel, someone else added, as if that were compassion. The field breathed. It inhaled the crowd and did not exhale dot. By midday, the officers erected a second arch to handle the overflow. By dusk, the overflow overflowed. A storm formed out at sea and chose not to come inland, which seemed like an omen until we remembered omens were just weather with fear laid over them like a stencil. The first day ended with a tally and a hymn. The second day began with more names. No one admits they knew it was surrender. The word used was present. We will present the children, the governor said, his hand hovering above a fountain pen, as if reluctant to touch anything that would leave ink on him. We present what we love to that which is greater. The priest nodded, grateful for theology he did not have to invent. To present is to offer without losing, at least in language. But the truth was simple and hard. We were giving them away. The place where the act became ritual was a low wooden platform at the far end of the field. A rope marked the border. On one side, families. On the other, the officers and their ledgers, the Schola Medica with their devices that clicked like teeth, the confessor whose mouth was a straight line carved by two hands pulling in opposite directions. When a child was named, the rope was lifted, not unknotted. Each parent kissed the top of a head, some once, some over and over, as if they could make the last touch count for all the touches that would not follow. A girl with a lopsided braid leaned into her father, so hard she left the shape of her cheek on his coat. He kept his hands open because closing them would have felt like refusal. Trust took many shapes, and none of them were comfortable. Some parents spoke brave words because someone had to speak brave words, or the world would collapse. "The Imperium protects," a mother said, her voice steady as scaffolding, while her hands shook like unbraced timber. A father murmured a list of saints as if they were coordinates that, if recited correctly, would draw a line between here and somewhere safe. "They will make you strong," an aunt promised, staging her face into a smile that looked like a wound taught to imitate a mouth. The children listened with the seriousness of those who know the world runs on adult decisions. They nodded and tried not to look at the rope. Not every surrender wore the same expression. There was bargaining. "Just one more night," a woman begged the registrar, who kept his eyes on the ledger, as if eye contact was a policy violation. There was denial. "He only talks in his sleep because his father did," a man insisted, forgetting that repetition is often how truth knocks. There was pride, real and raw. "My daughter hears the storms before they form," another said, daring the officer to write it down with admiration instead of alarm. And there was the quiet kind of trust that does not decorate itself with words, a nod, a release, a step back. I remember a boy named Talon because he made the air feel thinner when he walked past. He had the look of someone who had tried very hard to be ordinary and failed. His mother wore a scarf printed with flowers no longer grown in our soil. She had saved it for this day, thinking the pictures of life might argue with the reality of taking it. When the confessor asked her to relinquish her son's hand, she did not at first. Her fingers and his fingers were knots in the same rope. "The black ships are coming," the confessor said, and there was an ache inside the sentence that he did not intend to reveal. She heard the ache and mistook it for empathy. She let go. There was a family who brought their child at twilight, as if the hour might make a softer border between keeping and giving. The girl wore a bell around her wrist to warn the house when her sleep walk began. The bell did not ring once that walk. She looked straight ahead, not toward her parents, not toward the officers, but toward a point above and beyond the platform, as if she could already see the silhouette of a vessel that was not yet a fact. "Do you trust us?" the priest asked her father. The man answered with a question that tasted like blood. "What occurs to those who do not? Trust is an arithmetic performed under duress." We told ourselves this. To keep them is to doom them. To surrender them is to save them. The equation balanced on a promise. The black ships. The equation balanced on a time frame. Soon. The equation balanced on a story older than our city, older than our planet, that there is order vast enough to gather what is dangerous and turn it into something holy. We believed because we had to. Belief is a lever you pull when the machine of your life is too heavy to move by hand. The revelation was not in the words the officials spoke. It was in what people did with those words. They knelt. They kissed. They gave. They stood on the far side of the rope and watched their children be led toward a cluster of canvas tents that had been erected in the shape of a harbor, each flap a gate, each shadow a false hull. It looked like a ship if you squinted with your heart. The officers did not squint. They ushered, counted, recorded. The priests blessed. The confessor absolved. The schola affixed tags that whispered against collarbones when the wind rose. When night fell, the platform became a darker rectangle in the field, and the rope shone like a pale line of frost. Families remained long after the forms were signed, as if proximity could substitute for presence. They stared at the spot where their children had disappeared and imagined the steps beyond it. Inspection, instruction, embarkation, ascension. The imagination is a kindness and a cruelty. It fills the silence, and it fills it with precisely what you cannot bear to lose. The decision did not come in a vote. There were no raised hands, no shouted arguments. There was only the slow collective agreement to remain. Work schedules were remapped around the muster hours. Markets shifted their stalls closer to the field. The cathedral bells took on a new measure, a tempo arranged around the myth of incoming engines. Pilgrims arrived from outlying hovels with bundles and bedrolls, saying they had heard the call in their dreams, saying that dreams are often late but never wrong. The governor issued an order permitting families to encamp at the perimeter for the duration of embarkation. He did not define duration. He did not need to. Duration is what happens when nothing else does. Waiting faithfully is difficult because faith is not patience. Faith is an investment with no guarantee of return. We fed it with small rituals. We turned toward the sky at the same hour each night, the whole crowd tilting as if a single body. Children's names were recited in quiet pairs by parents who were practicing the sound of them without the person, as if they were building a keepsake out of air. Priests walked the rows with thuribles, smoking the encampment until the stars, when they showed, looked like punctures in a dark canopy, draped just above our reach. We taught ourselves not to count beyond a certain number of days because counting is a way to notice what is not happening. There were consequences, of course the kind that feel like the price you willingly pay for a joy you have not yet received. Work quotas slipped. The manufactorum complained and was ignored. The canal locks were manned by boys who were almost men and men who were almost broken. The harvest ran late and came in thin. Each shortfall was folded into the liturgy. When the ships come, we will recover. When the ships come, The burden you now carry will be sanctified. The word sanctified is how people survive what government cannot fix. And then there were the consequences no one would name. The children in the tent dreamed loudly. Sound travels differently at night. It unwraps itself and finds your ear, even when you lie with your face pressed to your own shoulder to muffle the noise. We heard them soft cries, gasps, the low murmur of a language spoken without instruction. Sometimes a note of laughter cut the air, and that was worse than any scream. The schola raised the perimeter lights to keep shadows small. The confessor added a line to the evening prayer, asking for rest without evocation, which made those who understood the word look down at the ground as if there were something there, too. I remember the first time the governor visited the encampment at night. He wore his crispest coat and stood at the rope with a practiced expression that could be read as compassion from a respectful distance. He promised news soon. The crowd believed him because they were tired, and because belief is a blanket you pull up to your chin when the cold has a name you dare not say. After he left, a rumor followed him like a dog that a signal had been received, that the astropath had fainted and awakened with a word in her mouth the priests were not allowed to hear. The rumor did not name the word. Rumors never tell you the real thing. They give you a shape and let your fear pour into it. Waiting faithfully means speaking as if the future is certain. It also means swallowing anything that would disturb the collective stomach. We ate our doubts whole, bones and all. Families who had brought blankets began to share with those who had not. Fires were built and kept small, as if we were afraid of competing with the coming light. A woman began to sing at the same hour each night, a simple tune that sounded like walking. Step, step, breathe. Step, step, breathe. The children in the tents soon breathed to that measure, and their sleep grew thinner but less violent. We took this as proof that faith works like a bomb, even across rope and authority. 4 times the sky pretended to change. Once a meteor scraped its fingernail across the firmament, and the whole field rose with a sound like one person gasping. Once the clouds pulled back and a silver seam split the dark, and we told each other that such seams appear before great vessels. Once the wind came from the sea, carrying a distant vibration that made our teeth ache. The priests called it a blessing, the engineers called it weather, the old called it memory. And once this was the worst, the horizon flared the way it does when the manufactoria vent heat down the channels at shift change. We knew what it was. We pretended not to. Pretending is how you practice for a reality that refuses to arrive. There were other kinds of consequences, quieter but more fatal. The city learned to reorganize its cruelty. Those who had never liked the children who spoke to empty corners now found a sanctioned reason to avoid their families. The market woman who sold beets began to wipe her hands twice after taking coin from a mother whose son's eyes sometimes tracked birds that were not there. The guards posted at the rope kept their hands near their weapons not because they expected attack, but because they were ashamed of their empty palms. Shame makes the hand heavy, and still we waited. We told ourselves that endurance is proof of righteousness, that people who falter at the last mile never deserve the finish line. We gathered evidence of our worth, the neatness of our tents, the order of our lines, the way we did not push when a child's name was called from the roster, and the rope lifted to let the family through for goodbyes. We behaved well because we believed good behavior would be noticed by engines. A boy who used to count beetles on the tent ropes began to count blinking without moving his lips. His sister said his numbers did not match the world's. A girl who had always loved voices started avoiding them because words arrived late in her head, and by the time she answered, the questioner had already gone. A gentle boy with the pale hands of children who have read more than they have run woke in the night and told the nurse that the tent had fallen through him. She told him it was a dream. In the morning, the stakes were pulled 6 centimeters outward on all sides, and nobody would admit to having touched them. Dreams multiplied and lost their boundaries. They leaked. At first we heard the children's sleep murmurs and told ourselves it was good that they were processing. Then the murmurs began to rhyme without the language changing, a cadence that made old men's tongues taste of copper. A girl hummed a tune that made a kettle sing off the boil. Another stared at a wall until a wet patch shaped itself into a map of coastline we had no ships to reach. The Schola Medica took notes. The priests lit more incense. The confessor added a question to confession. Have you felt more than you were meant to feel? People lied. People always lie when the truth is a sentence with no end. Fear turned what we had named gifts into punishments. The term blessed began to sound like a trap. Parents who had once stood straighter when their child was called sensitive learned to hold their elbows close and say the word tired instead. The children felt the shift. Their shoulders went up as if expecting weather. They started to apologize first for the unimportant things, then for existing too loudly, then for existing at all. The rope at the edge of the field kept its shape, but a second rope formed, invisible and effective, around every family that had given a child. Not all changes were fragile. Power showed itself in small, treacherous efficiencies. A boy could hear a conversation across the encampment and answer it as if he were standing 2 feet away. He learned new forms of cruelty by accident. A girl could repeat a prayer she had never been taught and make the priest flinch because she spoke his doubt along with the words. The kindest child I knew held his mother's hand and told her gently that her memory of a summer picnic was incorrect. He listed the missing details with affection, how the pears were mealy, how the dog would not stop staring at the river, and when he not stop staring at the river. Finished, she slapped him, because truth is sometimes a blow when it arrives uninvited. He cried without sound, and from that day the dogs would not come near him. The tents grew crowded with advice. Herbalists brewed teas that made the tongue numb. Old women placed bowls of salt beneath cots to catch what leaked out of the children at night. Men who had never prayed formed a circle and took turns saying the same sentence, "We will endure." The sentence wore a groove in the air, and for an hour each evening the encampment felt aligned, as if everyone's breathing had agreed to meet at a central point. Then the hour ended, and the children dreamed, and cups rattled on tables as if a heavy truck had passed very far away. I watched a girl named Nara stand at the rope and face the city. She was slight, her wrists too thin for the tag they had given her, and she had eyes that found the exact middle of whatever they looked at. "I can hear the bells before they ring," she told me once, not boasting, just making an inventory. That day she lifted her chin and murmured a word I did not catch, and on the hill the bells stumbled 2 quick notes, then the proper hour. When I asked her what she had done, she looked embarrassed. I reminded them we are still here, she said. She meant it kindly. The priest who overheard her added a paragraph to a sermon about humility and the dangers of interfering with God's instruments. He did not use her name, but she attended the service and kept her eyes on the floor. It takes very little for a gift to become a curse in a place that is starving for control. A boy who knew when a person was lying stopped being invited to the card games that kept men sane after midnight. A girl who could tell when someone was thinking of her pretended to cough every time her mother's grief gusted toward the tent. The kindest became the loneliest. The brashest found work for their talent in small extortions that looked at dusk like justice. The Schola Medica petitioned the governor to move the children into a separate enclosure for their safety. By morning, the fence stood. It was painted white. White makes everything look clean, even separation. Silence does not arrive on its own. It is imported, rationed, enforced. The governor began with notices, printed on paper that smelled cleaner than ours. Unauthorized speculation regarding fleet movements and astropathic communications constitutes sedition, they said. The sentence wore the costume of law, but everyone knew it was a leash. After the notices came the visits, polite at first, then efficient. A merchant who had told her customers that the ships were delayed by a plague of warp phantoms found her stall disassembled and neatly stacked beside the canal. A dockhand who claimed his cousin's friend had seen a black hole silhouetted against the cloud at sea was assigned to night dredging, which kills in inches. Rumor is a river. They tried to freeze it. The priests assisted in the way institutions assist, by substituting doctrine for fear. They preached about trial and tempering. They made a ceremony of closing the lips with 2 fingers and blessing the silence thus produced. They warned against vain curiosity, a phrase so beautiful that people said it to each other like a toast. The confessor met privately with those whose tongues had outrun their prudence and offered them penance or paperwork, whichever they preferred. Most chose penance because paperwork becomes a net that people forget they are caught in until they can no longer lift their arms. They banned certain words from public speech. Abandoned, for instance. Lost, forsaken. The permitted vocabulary turned us into gardeners, pruning our sentences until only safe stems remained. When the ships arrive, we said, even when we meant if. When the emperor wills, we said, even when we meant, if anyone is listening. Children learn the new grammar faster than adults, the way they always do. They corrected their parents with an eagerness that made the heart ache. You mean when, they said. You mean when, and the mother nodded and pretended the correction was a bomb. Silencing rumor did not stop the world from providing material. The astropathic tower in the city shuttered 3 of its windows and left the 4th open. Conservation, the herald said, but everyone could see that the open aperture was the one facing the field. Sometimes a thin smoke unspooled from it and drifted low, carrying a smell like cinnamon and coins. The Schola Medica declared that the odor had no medicinal properties, and therefore ought not to comfort anyone. It comforted anyway. People lined their sleeves with it by walking the boundary again and again until the guards told them to move along. Once, a woman stood up during a sermon and asked the simplest question: "Who is speaking to the ships?" She did not shout. She said it the way a person asks a baker if the loaves will be ready by noon. The priest placed both hands on the pulpit and recited a passage about roles and ranks and the dignity of ignorance. The woman nodded as if she were memorizing a recipe. That evening, 2 officials with careful smiles visited her tent and offered her a chance to assist in the kitchens at the hall. She accepted. The next day she did not return. The day after, her husband said that perhaps the loaves are better when made with fewer hands. The governor staged a parade to prove the city's spine still held. Militia uniforms, a brass band with valves that stuck in the cold, banners held by boys who could no longer grow from lack of meat. The parade circled the square twice and ended at the cathedral, where the motto carved over the doors looked freshly scrubbed: "Duty is its own light." The words glowed in the dusk, smeared with oil, so the last functioning lamps could find them. People stood and clapped for duty. Light remained a rumor. Silence requires participation. We learned to swallow questions before they reached the teeth. A mother stopped asking after her daughter's nightmares because the nurse's face had grown brittle from too many inquires. A man folded his maps away, tired of pointing to trajectories that would not be flown. A boy who had lied about seeing a ship confessed his lie and was rewarded with extra bread. From then on, truth had the flavor of hunger, and he ate less. The fences were extended another 20 meters and painted again, white on white until eyes ached. The consequence of silencing rumor is not peace. It is pressure. Pressure finds scenes in the evenings. The encampment practiced believing. We did it together because a lone belief can feel like a defect. Families gathered near the lantern cluster and recited the same assurances in the same order: the Emperor's gaze, the Navy's reach, the sanctity of our offering. The sentences were polished by repetition until they became smooth enough to slide across the mind without catching. After the assurances, someone would tell a sanctioned story about a planet saved by punctual black ships. The details changed every night, but the ending did not. We watched each other's faces to make certain the correct expressions were installed. If someone's performance faltered, someone else took their hand. Touch can stabilize a lie. The governors measured their success by the reduction of public disorder. Markets reopened near full capacity. The manufactoria picked up a quarter shift. The bell ringer struck the hours with a new crispness that was almost defiant. On certain days the field looked organized enough to pass for hopeful, and the photographer came back for more proof. He framed his pictures to exclude the fence and the children behind it. He had an artist's instinct for negative space. Whispers learned the routes that law cannot patrol. They moved along laundries and across canal bridges, slipped under tent flaps and into the hollows behind the eyes of people too tired to defend their hearing. They spoke with many tongues and one intention: to occupy the silence the governors had arranged. A whisper does not need truth to live. It needs vacancy. We had plenty. They began with the smallest treasons. The astropath died last winter, someone said, pouring rain. The tower is empty. The governor's mother gave him to the black ships, and they never sent word, someone else answered, threading a needle. He is making the world repay him. The priests use our prayers to keep the engines of the city warm, a child whispered to another child and then giggled, because the image was ridiculous and therefore lively. The ridiculous thrives where fear is heavy. It floats. Then the whispers took on shape. The ships came, a man told his neighbor, eyes on his boots. They came in the night, with no lights, and anchored off the black reef so no one could see. They will take the children at the new moon. His neighbor nodded in that neutral way that means belief. Will be rented on a nightly basis, paid in sleep. The ships will never come, a woman told herself, sitting alone. They were burned in the warp and their ashes fell into our clouds. Saying it aloud made the words feel domesticated, less likely to bite. She slept without dreams for the first time in days and woke terrified of what the quiet meant. Whispers moved through the fence like moth through lace. The children heard them first. Their faces recorded the flow of flinch here, a narrowing there, a gaze that slid away like a hand from a hot pan. A boy told me almost cheerfully, "They say we are bait." He said it the way a child says a new vocabulary word, proud of syllables. When I asked him who said it, he shook his head. Everyone, when they try not to. I wanted to correct him, to replace a splinter with a whole piece of wood. But when I opened my mouth, another whisper arrived and sat on my tongue. What if it is true? I closed my mouth. Law cannot command a tongue already occupied. Whispers learned to walk. They stood up in the marketplace and bought bread. They leaned against lamp-posts at dusk and watched the guards from beneath the brim of a cap. They volunteered in the kitchens, ladling stew with a steady hand. They folded themselves into the governor's dispatches as typos, and into the priest's sermons as unintended pauses. They perched on the scholars' clipboards and erased certain numbers when no one was looking. They were helpful. They were everywhere. They made people careful with their eyes. On the 29th night after the southern pylons failed, the remaining lights flickered in a new rhythm, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, and an old machinist muttered, "Not loud enough for the guards to hear? That is not a malfunction." The pattern repeated twice, then died. The next day, a notice appeared on the field's edge. Do not interpret accidents as signals. This is sedition. The paper was thick. The ink bled a little at the edges. A child traced the letters with her finger until a guard told her to stop. She did not look up. She did not stop. A wind came that smelled like ships, the tang of plasma, the ghost of ozone after a strike, and the entire encampment turned as one body, like grass bowing before a train. The sky remained unchanged. The wind curled itself around the cathedral tower and slid away. Someone laughed once, sharply, like a plate cracking. The laughter became a story by morning. They sent us a breath to prove they still exist. The governors did not post a correction. Some truths are too small to shoot. The law can forbid a shout. It cannot arrest the air the shout would have traveled through. And so the field filled with talk that never climbed above the level of the collarbone, each sentence cupped in a hand and offered like a secret pastry. Rumor acquired etiquette. People preambled with disclaimers. I do not say this, but I heard the way the pious cross themselves before risk. This was how I heard the one that had weight. It arrived in the mouth of someone who never spoke more than necessary. A signal came, she said. Eyes on the ground we all stood upon. It was a single word. She would not repeat it. She would not tell who heard it. She only said, it was not coming. After that, even the priests spoke more softly, as if their own breath might carry contraband. The governors added more notices. The militia doubled patrols. The confessor lengthened confession hours and fell asleep once sitting upright, lips moving around half-remembered absolutions. The fence grew another meter higher and a meter thicker, as if rumor could be kept out with geometry. We brought our chairs closer to one another because whispering is easier at close range. The children in the enclosure began to sleep during the day and watch the sky at night, and the schola wrote circadian realignment in a column and underlined it. Twice dot, there are laws about fire size within city bounds. There are no laws about how bright a memory may burn. People began to tell older stories and to tell them as if they had happened yesterday. The famine 2 generations back when the grain ships did not come but the raiders did. The winter of black snow when the manufactoria misfired and the sky fell for a week. The year the river changed course by a hand's width and half the district pretended to be surprised. Each story looked at the next and nodded, as if greeting a cousin at a funeral. Together they made a case against trusting horizons, and always, quietly, the real topic threaded through, the children and the ships and the line between them. We learned to braid questions into chores. "Have you seen the new notice?" one woman asked another while adjusting a rope. "They say the penalty for seditious speech is reassignment to the outer farms. Is that worse than this?" The other asked, and neither said the obvious, that the farms were where people went to vanish. A man stirring a pot observed, "The fence is white because white shows blood from far away." No one told him to hush. They only looked at the fence and then looked away. When the season finally turned, if it can be called a turn, it was more like a sagging our calendars failed us. The pebbles towered and toppled, the tent pole filled with scratches, and the child's arm with pale lines that looked like a private alphabet. The bells rang slower because metal contracts in cold. The sky took on a bruised blue at noon that made the field look underwater. In that light, faces lost their edges, and we could pretend we were not ourselves. Pretending as a kind of rest. On the last evening before the canal froze, a white fog slid in from the sea and lay along the ground like a patient animal. Sound moved strangely in it. Voices seemed to come from behind, footsteps from the side, and when someone laughed, it arrived first as a breath at the back of the neck. Children stood at the fence and blew into the fog to make tunnels. The fog accepted their offerings and gave nothing back. Then, from within the whiteness, a voice not loud, not official said very clearly, "They are late because they are empty." It might have been a jest. It might have been a child playing with a sentence. It might have been the fog teaching us how to listen. The guards barked for people to return to their tents. No one moved until the fog thickened and hid us from one another, and even then we lingered a moment longer, each person straining toward the space where the whisper had been, hearts cocked like dogs hearing a homeward bell that only they can hear. The first breaks did not appear as fractures in stone, but as ripples under skin's subtle coruscations, a tremble at the jaw hinge, a blink that lasted too long, as if the eye had to remember the order of opening. Then came the convulsions. They rolled through the children like wind through barley, one bending and then another, swaying toward a center none of us could see. It began at dusk, the hour the encampment had trained itself to breathe together. We were midway through the litany of endurance, when a boy spasmed and knocked his cup against the cot leg. The sound tin on wood was so clean it made heads turn. By the time we turned back, 3 children had already curled into parenthesis around nothing at all. The Schola Medica arrived with straps and language. Seizure Cascade, they named it, as if naming a storm can redirect lightning. They pinned shoulders, patted mouths, counted under their breath. Timed the rhythm, they instructed the mothers through gritted patience. Not every tremor demands intervention, but the bodies of the children did not care for protocols. Their hands opened, shut, opened, as if rehearsing the grasping of something not present. Their heels drummed like someone trapped beneath floorboards. One boy's head tilted as if listening, and his tongue formed a sound that was not map-able to the throat of any human. The nurse flinched and called for the confessor, who had learned to move fast without appearing to run. The fits did not come singling. They gathered themselves, arrived in pairs, then in choirs. Tents shuddered as if a weather had pressed its palm against the canvas. Lights in the encampment guttered, though the fuel was sound. The air acquired a taste. The faint iron of a bitten lip carried on a draft that did not come from any direction we knew. You could feel it at the back of the tongue, an instruction to expect. Expect what? Expect more. We tried to minimize the spectacle with walls and whispers, because panic travels faster than any diagnosis. The white fence grew tarps, and the tarps grew seams. The seams were never perfect. People counted the gaps like sailors counting stars. Guards learned to plant themselves near the places where the canvas lifted, and to do it with faces a child might still believe in. Parents quarreled with their own hands, wanting to soothe and wanting to keep their skin clear of whatever lay on the child's brow like fever no thermometer could claim. Then came the visions. Not the private kind that can be folded back down into the body like contraband, but public throw-no-no broadcast through the tent like light through a glass of water. A girl sat up too quickly, as if jerked by strings no one held, and described a corridor that smelled of old thunder. She named doors by numbers that smoldered at the edges, and then laughed once in a way that made even the priest look away. "The doors can hear me hearing them," she said. A boy stared at the tent pole, past it, insisting that it had become transparent with distance, and when we told him to hush, he answered with a man's patience, "If I hush, it is worse. Uncontrolled visions." That was the phrase the Schola chose, because it placed to blame in a neutral space, the mechanism, not the child. But what the children reported did not behave like ordinary imagination. It had texture, a grain that scraped the ear. They spoke of stairways sunk into sideways gravity, of voices that did not enter through the canal of the ear, but by some anterior method cheekbone, teeth, the tender hinge of the jaw. Some described music with no notes, a pressure that sorted thought by weight. The light ideas clattered aside. The heavy ones stayed and pressed dot by the third night. The fits had acquired an etiquette. They arrived at the end of the second watch, when people's bodies are too tired to posture. The guards passed the word along the fence like smolder. "It is beginning." Families stood and did not admit they stood. Mothers clasped rosaries without beads. Fathers learned to pray with their shoulders. We watched the Schola's shadows tilt and flutter across the dew canvas and thought about wings we had not earned. The field found its own cruel equilibrium, as crowds do. At the first sharp cry, conversation would sink in a wave. At the second, it would still. By the third, children who were not convulsing began to murmur in time with those who were, as if a metronome had been set within the collective skull. The confessor's lips moved around words that sounded like hinges. Open, close, open, close. In the pauses, you could hear the planet itself adjusting, soil compressing beneath so many feet that refused to leave. I remember a child named Orla swaying in a chair because her body could not decide between sitting and standing. Her eyes tracked a fly that was not there. She lifted her finger as if to teach the air how to land. "The windows are wrong," she whispered, and when I asked which windows, she looked at me as one looks at someone who has forgotten how to drink. "All the windows." Then she folded forward, not collapsing but being folded, like a letter whose message is unfinished. The nurse caught her head before it met the cot rail and said through her teeth, "Breathe with me." Orla breathed. I found myself doing the same, as if the child's lungs were the bellows for a fire we all needed. There is a difference between nightmares and messages. Nightmares end when you wake. Messages wait. The children's dreams acquired duration. They began where they had left off, night after night, with the rude persistence of a taskmaster knocking at dawn. One boy twitched in his sleep and spoke of an ocean that breathed, each wave a red lung unrolling across a shore of teeth. "It is not blood," he told the nurse in the morning, meaning to comfort her. "It is the memory of blood that the water has learned to wear." Another child woke with salt on her lips where no sea lay within a month's walk. She cried not because of the taste, but for the absence of a tide to explain it. The stars in their dreams were not ours. Our stars are the old grammar, cold and consistent, holes in the black canopy that suggest meaning by their arrangements. The stars they saw were nearer, hungrier, some too large, some too alive. They pulsed, and when they pulsed, the children's fingers pulsed with them, as if exchanging signal. Girls who had never seen a chart drew constellations with ash on canvas, spirals that bent inward like drains, ladders that had no rungs, only the memory of climbing. A boy named Jorik sketched a map of a sky that would not hold still. The lines refused to stay where he put them, ticked a degree to the left when he looked away. "They are not stars," he announced without pride. "They are mouths that have learned to glow." Astropaths came to the fence and peered through as if inspecting the quality of meat. Their eyes were scarred, their brows dotted with old constellations of burn, and their voices were the texture of paper folded too many times. They listened to the children's morning reports with a hunger that made the hair on my arms lift. "Common motifs," one said, chalking a phrase as a clerk might scrawl a tally. "Fluid returns," another murmured, and did not explain what that meant. They left with their sleeves dusted and ash from the sketches they brushed too carefully, as if some piece of the dream might adhere to the cloth and travel with them. What the children told us lined up like rails toward a place none of us wished to name. Night after night, the sea rose to the height of city walls and paused, breathing. Night after night, towers made of vertebra and bruised light leered above coasts that had not evolved the dignity of sand. A girl reported a door that grew in her sleep as she watched it, each hinge extruding like bone growth in time-lapse. In the morning she would not let any door shut of any kind without flinching, as if closure were a sin. A boy whose father had been executed during the harvest riots years ago spoke calmly about organisms that remembered their deaths so vividly they relived them in reverse, standing up from their own wreckage and walking into the light backward, unbleeding. "They practice," he said, and we all pretended to have a reason to look down. Some dreams were letters addressed to the living. A child repeated verbatim a promise a governor had made to his staff in private. Another named a ship registry from a world we had never traded with. A third listed dates with the serene authority of an almanac, and then, unable to stop itself, began to weep with the small, offended sob of someone whose hand has been forced to write a slur. The confessor tried to draw a line between prophecy and pollution, between grace and invasion. He found words for neither that comforted anyone. We learned to sleep in increments, like prisoners. Mothers napped with their hands on their knees, ready to stand at the first low moan. Fathers memorized the distance between cot and pail for when the vision ended as vomit. The Schola posted charts showing dream hygiene, avoid heavy meals, lie on your side, measure your breath, but the children's visions did not respect their posture. The door keeps returning, Orla told me, not angry, merely tired. It is proud of itself for learning how. The worst were the shared dreams. Children woke with the same word in their mouths, not a word any of us could write, a sound like a sob swallowed backward, and looked at one another with the shame of people who have discovered they have been overheard by their own kind. They described the same shore, the same red tide, the same sky with teeth. They touched the same spot on their chests as they spoke, as if expecting to find a wound that would make the telling legitimate. The Schola tried to split them up, to separate cots by more meters, to interleave quiet children between loud ones, as if insulation works in the soul as in a wall. The structure did nothing. Whatever traveled without regard for gaps. A priest asked whether the visions meant the black ships were near. He meant to find a foothold for hope. A child answered, "Near is the wrong word," and all the adults in the tent pretended to cough at once. There is a part of a city's brain that wakes when order begins to slip the old stem, all reflex and baton. It woke now. The first execution wore the uniform of ceremony, as such deaths always do when authority needs to impress not just the condemned, but the living. The governor spoke, careful with his vowels. The priest invoked light. The militia formed a neat rectangle with boots that had been polished with spit because wax was gone. The condemned was a man who had shouted at the fence in the second watch, demanding to see his daughter after a dream in which she appeared without eyes and told him she could still see him, just not with the organs he preferred. He broke the rope, and the guards broke him. The cart rolled out at noon. We were called to attend, called, not compelled, which is a finer compulsion. The phrase used was restore measure. The man stood on the dais with his hands tied and looked less like a criminal than like someone whose errand has been interrupted by a stranger with a story to tell. The confessor read a list of charges, some of which were true, others of which were words used to cover the silence between truths. When the volley came, the sound cracked off the cathedral stones and returned smaller, as if embarrassed. The body fell correctly. The crowd exhaled like a valve. Executions did not stop the convulsions, but they did calibrate the volume of the city. People learned the new octave quickly. You could see the instruction taking root in spine and jaw, the posture of caution, the mouth that slides around the word if and replaces it with when. A mother who had begun to tell the story of her daughter's dream in the market stopped at the verb and bought carrots instead. A man who had been copying the children's ash constellations for his own curiosity burned the pages and kept the soot beneath his nails like a memento he could not afford to display. The second execution arrived with less ceremony, which is to say more efficiency. A boy in the militia fired during a panic at the fence when 3 children began to speak in unison, and the guards mistook harmony for attack. The boy's shot winged a nurse. He wept so hard afterward that the governor's aide made a note about optics and had him executed quietly the next dawn for reckless discharge. The rumor outran the facts. By afternoon, the encampment knew. Mothers looked at the guards differently after that, as if their uniforms were not fabric, but a habit of mind that stiff. That stained dot after the 3rd and 4th, it became a rhythm. The city's proclamations gained teeth. Hysteria is treason. Rumor is warp. The notices looked almost cheerful in the cold, thick paper. Red ink, the double-headed eagle leaning just enough to suggest speed. The confessor lengthened penitential lists and shortened absolutions. The priest learned to end sermons before the congregation could begin to think. Thought is the most disloyal congregant. It always arrives late and leaves early. The consequence was visible in the children first, because children are instruments without dampers. They stopped telling us the details that might have saved us, learning the cost of specificity. The ocean became water. The stars became the sky. The door became a feeling. They edited themselves with small, apologetic smiles. The corrections made their mouths look older. A girl who had once drawn her ash spirals with the confidence of gravity began to smear them away with the side of her hand the moment they took shape, as if embarrassed by her own fluency. The ground around her cot darkened with the ghosts of erased diagrams. It was not only speech that tightened. Movement did. People lifted their feet less. They slid them, as if each step should avoid punctuation. Laughter retreated to rooms and was rationed like sugar. When someone joked, it felt like watching a child play near a cliff's edge, a thrill and a bile. The governor announced calm hours, during which the fence was to be approached only for sanctioned reasons. The hours spread, oozed, became the day. Calm acquired the shape of strangling. The city's appetite for examples could not be fed without casualties that would later be called mistakes. A woman was executed for slapping a priest during a vision that made him touch her child's face without permission. She died not because the slap was mortal, but because the idea that a hand could answer consecrated. Fingers made someone with a ledger nervous. A boy was shot in the leg during a stampede away from a tent where the children had begun to sing a tune with no notes. He was executed for obstructing militia movement, obstructing with the meat of his body, which is not a crime in any sane language, but sanity had been repriced. We pretended this was containment. We used words like resolve and stability and containment, and we deployed them the way engineers deploy sandbags stacked, neat, the illusion of defense against a rising fluid that does not care for geometry. The convulsions continued. The visions deepened. You cannot shoot a wave. You cannot nail down a door that dreamed itself larger each night. Executions tidy the surface. The deep remains. The children began to hide their breaks as best they could. A hand pressed to a twitching eyelid. A foot hooked around a cut leg to disguise a sudden jerk. They learned to speak softly during choral nights, when voices not their own used them as pipes. The scholar pretended to believe the disguises because belief is a policy that minimizes paperwork. Nurses learned to chart restful, next to names whose blankets were damp with fear. The confessor whose eyes had acquired the filmy distance of a man who has breathed too much incense and too much guilt, whispered a new prayer meant for his ears alone. If this is a test, make the grating kind. The encampment adjusted its rituals to absorb horror with the efficiency of a sponge. We changed the hour of the shared meal to avoid feeding during peak convulsion time. We invented a gesture, that little tilt of palm at the shoulder, to signal, "I see it, and I will not call attention to it." Merchants moved their stalls farther from the fence to shorten the distance between purchase and pretense. The bell ringer found a way to make the 6th hour sound warmer than the 7th, and that small mercy became a rumor that the 7th belonged to the children. People began to plan their pity accordingly. I do not know when I stopped believing the black ships would come. Disbelief did not arrive like a verdict. It seeped in, occupying the space where my mouth would have offered the tonic words. By the time the 4th child described the same ocean, by the time Orla concatenated a string of syllables that made the hair along my arms rise and stand like grass before a storm, by the time the governor's 5th proclamation was tacked to the fence and looked so new against the dirty white that people flinched from its cleanliness, I had begun to carry my hope like a relic, real enough to kiss, too brittle to use that the nightmares learned our schedule. They arrived at the edge of calm hours and coughed politely, then entered anyway. They threaded themselves through the white tarps and made silhouettes shiver like puppets hung badly. They tasted gunfire and decided it was seasoning, not threat. After the 7th execution, a night fell so clean you could hear your own pulse, and in that clarity a child sat upright and said, "Do not shoot. It is listening through the holes the bullets made." The guard nearest the flap dropped his rifle a measured inch and did not pick it up again until morning. Morning did not help. The sun rose like a coin flicked from a poor man's thumb. It bought nothing. People moved with the calm of those who have learned not to jostle their own dread. The priest's sermon was short and forgettable by design. The confessor's line extended past the bell tower. Absolution was 30 heartbeats and a touch. The governor's aide walked the perimeter with a clipboard and wrote, in a careful hand, appliance holding, and underlined it twice. The children slept in shifts and woke in agreement about the color of the sea that no one had taught them to name. We waited for the next execution, the way people wait for weather, checking the wind for policy, closing shutters around certain phrases. But dread and law had parted ways. In the tents, the visions cohered. The ocean returned, more intimate now, as if we had waded too far to back away without admitting wetness. The alien stars lowered bright enough that the children's pupils pinched in their sleep. One boy whimpered a word that made a nurse bite her knuckle to keep from answering. On the far side of the fence, somewhere the governors could not see and the priests would not admit, fear learned a new path. Gunfire can clean a square. It cannot launder a dream. The first breaks had widened into channels. and we heard the flow under our feet when we stood too still. Mothers lifted their faces at the same moment, unprompted, as if called by a bell no human hand had rung. Guards learned to look down because looking up made their eyes water and their discipline wobble. The governor signed another notice. The bell rang the hours. The fence remained white dot, and beneath it all, the nightmares continued unseduced by ceremony, unimpressed by rifles' proof that what comes for us does not need permission and will not be argued with. When the breaks began to multiply, when children jerked in their sleep and guards fired at shadows their nerves had conjured, the priests doubled their volume. Patience, they said, is the marrow of faith. Deliverance will come. The black ships are never early, never late. They are precise in the emperor's time, which is not our time. They said this with eyes fixed high, as if staring hard enough at the heavens would tear open a seam and let the promised prows emerge. The sermons lengthened until they became endurance trials. The priests read from worn missals until their voices cracked, then whispered prayers so fast they blurred into static. The congregation stood because sitting felt like surrender, but the cold gnawed at knees and hips until devotion bent into a crouch. Still the priests insisted. Endurance is proof of righteousness. Your waiting is a tithe more precious than coin. The field listened and tried to echo amen. The echo faltered, yet some did cling harder. Mothers pressed their children's empty blankets to their lips as the litany rang. Fathers raised fists and shouted oaths, daring despair to break upon their conviction. And there were always those who knelt at the rope, whispering prayers into the soil, as if the earth itself could carry them to the engines we no longer heard. Faith gathered itself into knots, tight, desperate, painful. But even conviction has a tone, and that tone thinned. At first the priests thundered. The emperor's gaze never wavers. His ships are a net in the void, catching every soul. Their words landed heavy, like stones on taut canvas. But with each week the thunder diminished. Their throats wore out. Their words repeated, looped, ate themselves like snakes. Patience, they croaked. Patience, the people began to notice. A boy whispered to his mother during service, "Why does he say the same thing again?" She hushed him, but the question clung to their faces like soot. The priest's eyes darted more often toward the governor's aides, who stood at the edge of the crowd, watching, clipboards in hand. The sermons became performances not for heaven, but for authority on the ground. Even the incense betrayed them. Supplies dwindled, and what once smelled of cedar and sanctity was replaced by the acrid smoke of damp resin. It choked more than it blessed. The faithful coughed, and coughing drowned the prayers. One night a brazier toppled, scattering coals through the crowd. Panic rippled, but the priest demanded we kneel again and see it as a trial. The coals were stamped out, but the metaphor lingered. Their fire was borrowed, and even borrowed fire can sputter. Week by week, the sermons rang thinner, like a drum stretched too far. People still stood, still mouthed the prayers, but their eyes wandered toward the fence, toward the silent tents of the children, toward the horizon that refused to answer. The field split itself without decree. Some clung harder. These were the faithful few. They gathered at dawn to scour the ground with brushes, polishing stones, as if purity of earth might hasten steel from sky. They invented new rituals, tying knots and rope to mark each day survived, then untying them at dusk as offerings of patience. They painted their faces with ash to mimic the penitent martyrs of old tales. The priests encouraged them, called them the marrow of the world, and in return the faithful sang louder, knelt longer, bled their own palms with nails driven shallow, to prove that endurance still had witnesses, but others drifted. They drifted not in body, where was there to go, but in spirit. They stood at the edge of the sermons, lips closed, eyes watching the wind. They left prayers unfinished. They began to mutter that perhaps the emperor had many children, too many to count, and that perhaps some could be set aside. They grew silent when the priests walked near, then whispered after they passed. Drift is subtle. It begins as quiet, then grows into distance. Between the two groups stretched a gulf of suspicion. The faithful few eyed the drifters as carriers of contagion, souls infected with impatience. The drifters, in turn, looked at the faithful and saw puppets, strings pulled by priests too desperate to admit their own silence. And every day the gulf widened, invisible but undeniable, like a hairline crack in a dam that knows one season of rain will finish it. Consequences arrived swiftly. The faithful demanded harsher penance from those who questioned, arguing that doubt was treason dressed as humility. They whipped themselves with knotted cords, then demanded others join. Some obeyed, out of fear more than belief. Others refused, quietly, but their refusals were noted. The governor's aides marked names on slates. Markets, once neutral ground, became battlegrounds of tone. The faithful few traded blessings with every loaf of bread, while the drifting learned to walk quickly, heads down, avoiding the net of zeal. A single careless word a mutter, a sigh could spark confrontation. Once a man asked his neighbor, "Do you hear the engines?" with too much irony in his voice. By nightfall the priests had denounced him from the pulpit. The next day he was gone. His stall remained empty. The choice to cling or drift became consequence in itself. And the children behind the fence, those who dreamed oceans and stars, watched with wide eyes, learning what divisions look like, learning how faith curdles into law. It was inevitable. Hope itself began to sour. What began as patience, what began as endurance, began to twist. The faithful few whispered that perhaps the black ships tarried because we had not suffered enough. Perhaps more sacrifice was needed. A rumor spread that the emperor favored only those who gave until it hurt, until it bled, until they had nothing left but the waiting itself. So penances deepened. Fire walked across bare feet. Faces pressed into coals. Families who hesitated were branded cowards, their tents vandalized with smears of ash shaped like eagles. In the night I heard voices murmuring prayers not to the emperor, but to the very silence that consumed us, as if silence were a god itself. "Answer us," they begged the void. "Take us, if not them." The drifters saw this and recoiled. To them it was heresy disguised as holiness. But even they were not immune. Some whispered that perhaps the black ships would never come, not because we had failed, but because the emperor had decreed it so, that he had abandoned this world as tithe, a calculated offering to keep others safe, that we had been chosen, not for deliverance, but for ruin. The sermons thinned further. Priests' words stumbled, broken by coughs, swallowed by winds. The faithful few shouted louder to cover the gaps, their chants raw, their eyes hollow. The drifters stood further apart, murmuring their own counter-sermons in shadows. Two faiths now, each certain of its truth, one clinging to suffering as proof, the other drifting into resignation. And in the middle, between them, the children's dreams thickened. They spoke of oceans that rose higher, of stars that pulsed nearer, of voices that demanded recognition. The fence creaked at night as if leaned upon by something vast. Hope was no longer a lantern. It had become a knife, sharp, dividing, dangerous. The faithful few wielded it like a blade. The drifters let it rust in their hands. Either way, it cut. And so we reached the edge of the unthinkable. Patience not as virtue, but as poison. Faith not as shield, but as heresy. What had once been the marrow of endurance began to rot. And in that rot, something darker prepared to grow. Hunger arrived as arithmetic before it arrived as pain. The ledgers tightened, first columns narrowing. Margins full of sums done twice in different inks. The grain stores scraped bottom, the oil casks tipped and produced only the sound of a last reluctant drop. Merchants began to weigh bread with their eyes before they weighed it on their scales. In the manufactoria, machines that should have throbbed with steady covenant began to cough, then fall silent, belts hanging slack like tongues. We still lined up as if routine itself were caloric, as if the act of standing in order might feed us, but the lines ended at emptiness more often than at food. Scarcity is a grammar. Everyone learned it. Meals halved, then quartered. Bones were boiled until they confessed every secret, and then boiled again, to be certain nothing holy remained. The canal fish retreated to deeper water, or perhaps we only told ourselves that to justify empty nets. Salt became a luxury. People licked their fingers after touching it, as if skin could be seasoned into hope. Fires were built small, then smaller, to hide their poverty. Smoke thinned until it was merely a suggestion of warmth. The idea of heat passed from mouth to mouth. Hunger breeds rooms where rules cannot enter. Night markets bloomed and withered in alleys, trading scraps of tallow, unidentifiable cuts wrapped in newspaper, powders and twists of cloth that promised sleep without dreams. The governor's guards made a theater of confiscation at noon and bought back what they had seized after dark at twice the price. Priests blessed broth that would not have fooled a child, then refused their own cup with pious faces and empty bowls. The bell ringers struck the hours duller, as if metal could be taught compassion. Chaos grew like mold from damp corners. Fights began over crumbs and then moved on to words, because words can be eaten repeatedly. Accusations became currency: hoarder, heretic, unmother, ungrateful. The faithful few tightened their belts and their doctrines. The drifters learned to move with eyes down, hands loose, hearts locked. Guards set curfews they could not enforce, and then enforced them on the nearest back. The Schola Medica reduced their treatments to advice and prayer, neither of which stops a stomach from shrinking. Inside the fence, the children suffered differently. Hunger made their eyes larger, their wrists smaller. It did not quiet the visions. If anything, it sharpened them, as if absence of meat left more room for whatever used their minds as instruments. They dreamed louder. They woke more brittle. Nurses learned to pour water into cups as if performing a rite, so that the sound of it could pass for a feast in a child's ear. The nights stretched until they felt like one continuous tunnel, broken by brief. Humiliating dawns. Then the thefts began. Bags from tents, sacks from carts, a child's shoes at the rope while her mother prayed. We pretended this was misfortune when it happened to friends, and moral failure when it happened to strangers. The governor's notices grew larger and redder. The confessors' lists of sins grew longer and quieter. The priests preached patience to bellies that had learned other liturgies. The field held, because fields hold. It is what they are for. People did not. They frayed. It started with fingernails, half-moons of keratin, growing thick and translucent like horn. New crescents climbing over old until cutting them required a knife and a lullaby. Stress response, the schola said, their mouths making the shape of science, while their eyes measured distances to exits. Then skin changed first to shine along the forearms, a lacquered gleam that caught light oddly, as if refracting it from a second angle. Then textures, faint ridges that ran like writing along collarbones, spirals that matched the ash constellations a girl had once drawn on canvas and smeared away. A boy woke with his teeth aching and found them subtly reorganized. The canines thickened, the incisors set with the faintest inward tilt, as if preparing to meet a different kind of food. A girl opened her eyes from a long dream and kept them open without blinking for a count of 600 before the nurse, weeping, cupped her lids closed by hand. The child apologized for frightening her. "It is only the air looking back," she said, serene and starving. Some changes were not visible until someone spoke the right word, and the change answered like a sleeper prodded from the correct angle. The children's hearing became selective, able to ignore the closest scolding, and yet attend to the shuffle of a boot at the far fence. Their balance altered. During convulsions they no longer toppled from cots, but rode the tremors like waves. A kind boy named Cad turned his head to listen to a bell far across the city and tilted the other ear, saying softly, "There is another bell inside this one, ringing backward." The priest told him not to blaspheme. Cad smiled sadly. His gums had paled to a near luminous white. Hair took to growing where hair should not, and failing where it should. Eyelashes fell out from one child and sprouted along the outer ear of another, like a fringe of sensitivity, taught to migrate toward the source of threat. A girl's pupils filmed over with a reflective sheen that made her look forever photographed. When she turned toward the tent flap at night, the guard outside swore he saw himself standing where he stood from the angle of a taller, thinner world. The fence grew busier with visitors who would not name themselves. Off-worlders do not admit presence when presence is a crime. They send gloved hands and instruments with fewer joints than fingers ought to have. These measured the children with light, with hum, with scents that drew breath from the strange ridges on their arms. The visitors took notes that did not look like text, only columns of hatchings that thickened with wonder or fear. They left quickly and poorly, like guests who have eaten too much at a house they are ashamed to have entered. Parents tried to treat the changes as weather. We laughed at the horny nails until they scratched linen. We brushed the lacquered skin and called it sheen. We braided hair that sprouted where it shouldn't, and joked that fashion now starts with hunger. But when a child sneezed, and the candle flame leaned toward, rather than away from the breath, when another exhaled and frost webbed outward along the cot rail, as if breath had decided to learn direction, the jokes fell away like chaff. Rumor, never sated, learned a new word. mutation. It tasted of shame and possibility. The faithful few called it trial and warned that any naming outside liturgy would invite corruption. The drifters called it truth and spat when they said it, to bless the ground against what had already arrived. The Schola Medica proposed terms that disguised fear in syllables. The confessor proposed shorter prayers. The children proposed nothing. They watched us with eyes that kept changing temperature, sometimes cool as wells and sometimes fever-hot, as if the gaze itself were deciding what body to inhabit. The question stepped out of whispers and sat in the middle of the field like a judge. Hide them or burn them? It did not come from the governor, who preferred decisions that could be stamped and filed. It came from hunger and fear, which together serve a harsher sovereign. The faithful few argued fire. Purity, they said, and the word sounded clean in their mouths. Scrub it of ash and empathy. Better ash on our hands than rot in our souls. They counseled swift mercy with torches, the mercy that stops a story before it learns to speak its last word. Others, not faithful, not faithless, only exhausted, argued for hiding. We have hidden worse, they said, remembering winter cellars and harvest riots, and the year the tax collector's list was shorter than the names at the infirmary. We know how to keep a room cold enough to slow a fever, warm enough to trick a breath. They offered basements, crawl spaces, the hollow behind the old kill, the tunnels where canal workers once slept on sacks of sand when the locks still obeyed a schedule. Hide them until the ships come, they said, then did not look at the sky. The priests tried to stand between the two, fires literal and metaphorical, and were scorched by both. Sanction is not ours to give or deny, they insisted, but their sermons had thinned too much to bear a moral that heavy. The confessor proposed triage by symptom, as if a taxonomy could absolve a butcher's choice. The Schola Medica, pressed to advise, recommended isolation and observation and used the word humane too often to trust it. Parents made their private calculations. A mother pressed her ear to her child's chest and listened to the two beats, there the human and the other, and decided a cellar would be kinder than a pyre. A father, seeing his boy's teeth glisten with a new edge and dim light, pictured what a soldier must picture when the order comes, and folded his hands to keep them from being useful. Families who had nothing else in common learned that the roots between tents where a child could be passed hand to hand without crossing a guard's sight line. Others sharpened tools and slept beside them, inhaling iron until the dream changed flavor. The governor issued an edict that pretended to be about hygiene and was about fear. No sheltering of unregistered minors outside sanctioned enclosures. The militia patrolled with torches, practicing the flick wrist that sends flame forward without thought. The first basement was found by the smoke it made, and not by the mercy it begged. The family was marched into the square at noon to make an example. The crowd was invited to witness civil sanitation. Fire makes an argument better than any speech. The ash drifted lightly, like the snow we no longer had. Hiding did not stop. It only learned new corridors. The city is older than law. It remembers how to fold itself into pockets. Under the laundries, behind the broken stair, in the hall of records, along the rubbish trenches no one bothers to map there, the children were kept, rocked without lullaby, because sound carries. Sisters took turns breathing for their brothers during fits, so the air would not grow too loud. A boy learned to sleep standing up behind a water barrel. A girl learned to keep her hands inside her sleeves when the nails hurt for growth. People passed food to the hidden, as if feeding a god that would be cruel if starved, and still others lit fires. A coven of the faithful few dragged a cot into the open and surrounded it with coals. The child upon it did not recognize their zeal as love. She only recognized heat. Her mother screamed the old holy names until she found the new unholy one, and it burned her tongue to say it. The guard fired into the air to make order and hit the sky accurately. Order did not return. The fire ate. The crowd watched. When it was over, the air smelled clean in the way only horror can make it. Too late. The words arrived with the first wind that tasted of metal and rain. We were still counting votes no one would honor, still arguing basement versus pyre, still translating love into policy, when the fence bowed inward, as if a great chest had sighed against it from the other side. The children in hiding stiffened as one organism and turned, their faces toward a corner of the city that had no name on any of our maps. In the field, a notice tore from its nails and skated along the ground like a white fish. A bell rang the wrong hour twice in quick succession. We lifted our eyes by reflex, by hope, by habit and the sky, patient and empty for so long, answered at last with a sound that was not an engine and not a storm. The decision hide or burn hung, unmade between the last breath and the next breath belonged to something else. It is a known thing in the Imperium. When enemies refuse to appear, governors manufacture them. Our governor was no exception. The black ships had not come. The children muttered in dreams too loud to ignore. Whispers had grown teeth, and hunger had stripped the last meat from bone. So he armed the militia not outward, not against an invading force from the stars or the sea, but inward. The rifles that once drilled against imagined Xenos now rested on neighbors, pointed down alleys where bread had disappeared, aimed across markets where words grew dangerous. The militia patrolled in groups of 6, boots pounding cadence against stone. They wore helmets polished brighter than their rifles. The shine meant to reassure those who watched, though it reassured no one. The men were drawn not from veterans, but from the young and desperate. Boys who had once pulled nets, men who had once hammered in manufactoria, shoulders knotted by labor, minds soft enough to be rewritten. They marched because marching filled the belly with rhythm, if not with food. Their rifles gleamed, their bayonets sharper than any knife left in the city's kitchens. At first, the rifles were aimed high warning shots, displays, the theater of power. But theater exhausts its audience. After weeks without ships, without news, the muzzles lowered. Markets emptied at the sight of gray uniforms. Families stepped back from windows when the boots clattered near. It was easier to stay inside than risk a question shouted in your face. Where did you get that bread? Why is your child still healthy? What were you whispering when the bells rang? The priests blessed the rifles, chanting verses as oil slicked metal, anointing them with incense smoke. These weapons are the emperor's fingers, they declared. They will pluck the weeds from his field. The militia listened and nodded, but their nods were brittle. They were hungry too. Their uniforms made them less starving only in appearance. And so rifles turned not against invaders from beyond, but against the very people who once prayed for deliverance beside them. Then came the order. It was not shouted from the cathedral steps. It was not printed on paper for the city to read. It was whispered in briefings, etched in notes that burned after reading. Purges, the governor commanded. Containment through reduction. Too many mouths. Too many doubts. Call the rot before it spreads. At first, purges were disguised as accidents. A fire in the bakery quarter, suspiciously thorough. A canal gate jammed so water swallowed 3 streets whole. A collapsed bridge that conveniently erased an entire neighborhood of dissenters. But disguises grow tedious, and the governor's patience thinned. Soon arrests became public, block by block. Those who had spoken too loudly about ships, about psykers, about hunger, were pulled into squares and lined against walls. The rifles fired not upward, but into chests. The bodies were left until dusk. Reminders hung heavier than banners. The priests, cornered by their own sermons, bent scripture to fit the blood. The emperor prunes his vineyard, they preached. Each cut makes the whole stronger. Yet even their words sounded weary, like bells cracked by too much ringing. Citizens attended executions not from zeal, but from exhaustion, because not attending drew suspicion. Heads bowed not in reverence, but to avoid eye contact with neighbors, dragged to the front. The governor stood on a balcony above it all, coat immaculate, voice rehearsed. "Sacrifice is salvation," he intoned, the phrase repeated until it lost all grammar. He promised order, promised ration increases once the heretics were gone. But the rations did not grow. Only the piles of ash did dot. When the psykers' mutations worsened, the governor seized opportunity. "Contamination," he declared. "Warp sickness. It spreads by presence, by tolerance." His eyes scanned the square, and those who looked away were marked. Families who had hidden children were exposed. Tents were overturned, basements searched, canals dragged for signs of escape. When a hidden child was found, the whole household was condemned. The militia brought torches, and fire became the only verdict that mass purges followed. Whole districts encircled, homes burned to flush out whispers. Screams carried over rooftops, mixed with hymnals that priests forced into the air to drown them. Families barricaded doors, only to be buried alive when the militia lit the beams. Cities are meant to endure, stone meant to last centuries. But stone burns too when faith is weaponized. The manufactoria collapsed under their own flames. Bridges melted. Towers toppled not from war against the alien, but from war against ourselves. Fire writes history quickly. The governor's purge turned the city into parchment, inked in black smoke. Flames devoured faster than hands could write down names of the dead. Whole avenues once filled with markets collapsed into skeletal frames of iron and brick. Statues of saints cracked and melted, their eyes weeping stone. Families fled into the streets only to be met with rifles. Some begged, some cursed, some tried to barter with heirlooms that meant nothing to hungry men in uniforms. The militia, half-starved, half-terrified, obeyed orders because orders gave their suffering a rhythm. They marched from fire to fire, setting, shooting, purging, their boots crunching on embers where children had played. The air became impossible to breathe. Ash settled on shoulders like judgment, coated tongues until every word tasted of charcoal. The canals boiled with runoff, fish floating pale and belly up. The bells rang through smoke, each toll like a nail hammered into a coffin too vast to imagine. and yet the governor called it order. He stood again on his balcony as the city glowed behind him, a silhouette of authority carved from arrogance. "We have cleansed," he said. "We have pruned. We are safe." But his words fell into ears already deafened by the roar of collapse. Some fled beyond the walls, carrying hunger into the wastes. Others dug deeper, burrowing into basements, tunnels, ruins. But there was no escaping the fire. It spread with the certainty of doctrine. By the end, districts that had stood for centuries were leveled. The governor's last stand was not against enemies from without, but against his own people, his own streets, his own history. The city he ruled was ash, and he mistook the silence of ruin for obedience. The governor believed fire had solved the problem. He believed ash was final, but ash conceals embers, and embers wait. The children, those left unburned, those hidden beneath floorboards, those chained in basements rather than given to the pyres, began to stir. Their dreams had thickened through hunger, through fear, through fire. Now they bled into waking dot in the silence after the purges. As smoke drifted and embers cooled, the ground itself trembled. A low vibration, too even to be chance, passed through the ruined avenues. Survivors looked to the sky for ships, but the sound came from below, from the basements, from the ruins, from the very bones of the city. Eyes opened in the dark eyes with sheen not born of humanity. Mouths whispered words that scorched the air, though they were barely spoken. Nails scraped stone, carving spirals that glowed faintly, even after the hand lifted. The psykers had not died. Fire had not killed them. Fear had only sharpened them. Those who listened closely swore they heard choruses beneath the city, voices humming at a cadence too precise to be random. "We are still here," the voices said, though no lips moved. Mothers who had hidden children felt their arms prickle, as if touched from within. Guards patrolling burned streets dropped rifles and crossed themselves, then denied they had heard anything at all. The governor slept in his palace that night, convinced he had won. But outside his walls, in the ruins still smoking, the true battle stirred. The children were no longer merely dreaming. They were waking. The city had burned down to a hush that clung to brick and bone. In that hush, the first mind split. It did not crack like crockery. It opened like a throat swallowing the wrong way, an inward gasp that dragged something through. The boy's mouth stretched, but the sound came from everywhere at once, a chord too wide for a body. Lanterns guttered, though no wind passed. Ash lifted and hung as if listening. Then another mind opened. A girl whose eyes had learned to photograph the dark blinked once, and behind her lids an alphabet no human hand had drawn rearranged itself into command. The canvas of the tent sweated. The cot stammered under her pulse. Words formed not from the tongue, but through it. They slid out like wire pulled from a wall and left wounds of meaning. People reached to comfort her and pulled back, fingers haloed with frost, though the brazier smoldered hot. Voices arrived with the confidence of proprietors returning to a house they had leased long ago. They wore the children like doors. Some voices were oil slick, insinuating, promising warmth if you only stopped moving. Others were gravel, grinding sentences that made teeth ache. One, I swear, was music no notes, only ratios that made the skull ring until you could not tell if the sound lived in the air or in your marrow. The nurses learned new reflexes, to hold a jaw against dislocation, to bind wrists without bruising, to pray without words because words drew attention. The militia, having conquered nothing but char, approached with rifles low and eyes higher than courage. When the first chorus spoke through 3 children at once, the nearest soldier fired reflexively. The bullet struck canvas and went out into the night, embarrassed. The voices laughed. It was not cruelty. It was acknowledgment, the way an ocean might chuckle when a man slaps it with his palm. Convulsions changed timbre. No longer seizures, but rehearsals bodies learning choreography from an unseen teacher. Shoulders rolled to make room for syllables that were larger than breath. The children's ribs flexed like instruments warming, and between spasms there were moments of exquisite stillness, the kind that turns the smallest sound into scripture. A cough, a buckle's creak, the wet slip of a tear leaving an eye. In those stillnesses we heard the truth. This was not invasion. It was alignment. The rumor first. A half-sentence passed hand to hand like contraband fruit. Lost, not delayed. Not diverted, lost. The astropath's tower, once the city's lone listening bone, admitted nothing, and that nothing became admission. A courier from the coastal stations arrived with eyes like pits and a note burned along one edge. Contact broken in translation. Last ping. We are unmoored. The priest called the note a test. The confessor called it a lie. The governor called it sedition and had the courier removed. But removal does not touch a truth once it finds bone. Then the children began to speak coordinates. Not ours. They unspooled vectors and measures no navigator taught them, star angles bent through mediums unnamed in any naval catechism. They drew their arms through air and described spirals that widened, as snapped, like rope too long under strain. They were eaten, one child said without malice. Not in teeth. In direction, another corrected gently. Not eaten. Dissolved into places. The nurses wrote nothing, because writing would have made it real. The survivors of the purges, those who now lived in stairwells and beneath collapsed transepts, lifted their faces from their hiding and asked the question out loud because whispering had made no dent. Where are the ships? The answer arrived in the children's harmonized breath, a sound like a map folding in the wrong order. Then the girl with the photographed eyes said, almost apologetically, "They are not in time with us." A militia sergeant, hunger thin and doctrine fat, demanded proof. The proof came as a smell ozone braided with the remembered sweetness of a garden we had never tended, then as pressure, as if the city had been placed inside a fist that decided not to close, for now. Windows flexed. The surviving bells thumped once, dumbly. Far out at sea, a dark band sank an inch and rose as if breathing. The sergeant aimed at the ocean and shouted orders too small for water. The children turned their heads toward a point above our understanding and listened to silence arrive as information dot. Once loss had a name, choice grew fangs. Survival had been hunger, had been silence, had been waiting. Now it acquired a vector, toward the voices or against them. The faithful few thinned, blistered, eyes glazed with smoke and certainty declared any alignment damnation. Cut the channels, they pleaded. Plug the mouths. Silence the instruments by which the warp sings. They held torches with hands too steady to be sane. Others, past patience, argued the opposite. The ships are gone. Salvation is unmoored. The children here, let them speak. Let them translate whatever looks back. They did not name it faith. They named it adaptation, the virtue of people too tired to decorate their fear. Parents knelt beside beds and made bargains with the air. Take us, not them. Take our names, leave their bodies. Take our city, leave a corner where we can set one table. The air did not answer. The children did. And so the decisions came messy, mortal. Some bound mouths with cloth and prayers. Some removed the cloth when the child began to choke on a word it could not exhale. Some locked doors. Some took doors off hinges, having learned from dreams that doors grow. One father placed a pistol on the table and told his sons they would shoot him if his eyes turned stranger than love. One mother held a kitchen knife and sang to it until the blade warmed, as if praise could teach steel to pity. The governor, who had mistaken ash for obedience, issued edicts like coughs. Containment, isolation, immediate reporting of anomalous articulation. His militia dragged children toward vans that stank of bleach and fear. Twice the vans reached the edge of the square and failed to turn the drivers sitting with hands on wheels, faces slack, as if a voice had told them that forward no longer existed. The priests promised absolution to those who resisted temptation, then took confessions with shaking hands from those who had not. The confessor learned a new liturgy, forgiveness formatted for people who had chosen their children over their emperor. He whispered it and hoped the sin of the prayer would be overlooked by a God who had seen cities burn. Damnation ceased to be a threat the priests could wield. It became a geology, a layer settling over us soft at first, then caking hard. To survive, you bent. To protect your own, you listened when the voices asked you to lower the lantern, to close the door, to draw a symbol on the floor with your heel. To avoid a purge, you pointed your neighbor's tent out to the guards. To keep bread in your child's hand, you swallowed the word never and replaced it with not yet. The price ledger grew longer than any food ledger ever had. It did not arrive as absence. It arrived as completion, like the last piece sliding into a shape you had not meant to assemble. The children sat up in the same second. The air took one breath and held it. Somewhere deep under the cathedral, water stopped its patient drip. The bells, those that still had tongues, quivered and chose not to speak. Even the fires learned to hold their crackle in their lungs. We waited for the voices, primed to flinch, ready to choose again between knife and prayer. Nothing came. The children looked past us, over us, through us with gentleness, not contempt, and then down at their hands as if surprised to find them still there. In that final silence, every decision we had made became visible. You could see the soot on the faithful, the chalk of hidden runes on the drifters, the grease of rifles on boys who had never wanted to carry them. You could see the governor's coat, immaculate and obscene. At the far end of a balcony no longer attached to a palace, the silence was not peace. It was a mouth opening. It was the city inhaling before a word. The waiting was not failure. It was design. The truth did not descend. It rose from documents kept too clean, from orders signed with hands that had never touched a child's hair, from the scholas cum marginalia. Population, high psychic density, risk index, strategic, outcome preference, warp chaff. The courier who smuggled the file had the look of someone who has carried his own death folded in his pocket long enough to be polite to it. The paper was thin and official. The wax was black and patient. We read the words together, because sharing a wound is sometimes the only way to keep from fainting, not failure, not oversight. A calculus. Leave the gifted gathered. Broadcast compliance. Announce ships. Delay. The warp ever hungry will swarm to the brightest bait. A planet of open doors. For the safety of the Imperium at large. Loss acceptable. The Imperium never planned to return for them. The sermons had always sounded like promises because we were polite enough to make them so. But the mathematics behind them had another name. Containment by sacrifice. It was all there in the ink we could not wash out, the timeline that converged on our famine, the resource convoys that veered 3 systems wide, the authorization unsigned, but not unwilled, to let the fire do what the Navy could not stomach. The governor had not failed upward. He had followed orders. He had made torch and ash a policy, an answer to the warp that would not reflect on the men who wrote the plan. We looked at one another and saw new ghosts standing just behind our shoulders, the ones we would become if we pretended not to have read it. A mother tore the page and fed it to the brazier. The flame flinched. An old man folded his fragment and tucked it into his shirt as if to keep one splinter of truth close enough to irritate his heart until it stopped. The priest closed his eyes and opened them again and found he could not return his face to its old shape. The children were bait. Left as sacrifices to choke the warp dot, it explained the simplicity of our summons, the certainty of the rope, the efficiency of the tents arranged like a harbor. It explained the white fence repainted after ash. It explained why rumor had always outrun relief. We had been arranged. The children had been exhibited at the edge of reality like meat hung in the salt wind, their dreams bleeding into the air to call everything hungry. The warp had answered. Our city had fed it. And somewhere far away, worlds we would never see slept a little safer, because we had kept the monsters busy with the tenderest throats we owned. Parents who had nothing left to break broke then. Some knelt and pressed their foreheads to the cold ground, not in worship, but to feel a surface that was not lies. Others stood and looked at the horizon as if it had personally deceived them, which, in a way, it had. The militia lowered rifles and stared at their hands, as if expecting the rivets of their weapons to confess on their own. The governor slept behind 3 doors and did not dream at all. The last line of the document was the smallest. Designation, tithe. It sat there with the arrogance of neat figures, a word that made holy a slaughter it refused to name. Offered, not abandoned. Not lost, offered. The difference mattered to whoever wrote it. It changed nothing in our mouths. The children, hearing what we had read, did not weep. They touched their chests, each in the same place, as if feeling for the stamp that had made them valuable. Then, together, as if a bell we could not hear had been struck, they lifted their faces to the sky. The final silence tightened. Somewhere beyond cloud and cold, something noticed the completion of its pattern. The air waited with us, and we understood the meaning of that waiting at last, not hope, not failure, design. And design, once satisfied, moved to function. The planet did not fall all at once. It screamed first, a long, ragged cry that rose through stone, through timber, through the marrow of every spine. It was not sound alone, it was vibration, a resonance that unseated teeth and made eyes water without grief. Reality tore open in seams that had always been there, invisible until the weight of sacrifice split them wide. The air shimmered. Streets folded into themselves. Towers leaned at angles no engineer could name and hung there, trembling, before collapsing inward like lungs expelling the last breath. Oceans convulsed as if struck from below. The sky, black for so long, bloomed with colors too violent to endure. Crimson spirals, green lightning, the violet pulse of suns dying out of sequence dot, and in the center of it all, the children, those who had been bait, those who had carried the voices stood upright, eyes lit from within, mouths speaking choruses that were not their own. Through them the warp reached for us, and through us it reached for more. Every prayer we had whispered into the dirt, every plea for ships, every chant of patience became fuel for the fire tearing through the veil. The faithful few were the first to understand. Kneeling with rosaries and torches, they raised their faces to the sky, as if mercy still waited there. But the truth arrived too late. The Emperor's gaze was never turned toward us. His mercy had never been meant for our soil, our children, our names. We were tithe. We were offering. We were ash long before the fire touched us. Their cries for deliverance curdled into silence as one by one their voices were swallowed into the roar. The cost of waiting revealed itself in full, not just a death of flesh, but erasure. Body, soul, memory each pulled apart and fed into the wound we had been arranged to keep open. Streets where we had lived folded flat and then were gone. Names passed from mother to child unraveled, as if language itself had betrayed us. Even memory grew porous, fading even as we tried to clutch it. The very idea that we had been here began to dissolve. The black ships never came because they were never meant to. They had never been late. They had never been lost. They had simply not been destined for us. We were the cord cut from the cloth so the rest of the Imperium could remain whole. Our patience had been worship. Our waiting had been labor. And our labor's only fruit was annihilation. The planet screamed again, and then it did not. What remained of us was silence, and so we returned to the first silence, the silence of the unbroken sky. No ships, no engines, no mercy, only prayers, unanswered, still hanging in the void like ash that never falls. Final poetic line, in the Imperium, to wait is to die slowly and unseen. If you dare to hear more truths buried in silence, whisper void in the comments.